On the unforgiving plains of the Texas Panhandle in 1875, a lone cabin stood as a monument to one woman's stubbornness. Her name was Martha Sullivan. She was a widow who had buried her husband, her hopes and her fears, all in the same patch of stubborn dirt. She thought she was done with the world, and the world was done with her. But the frontier is never truly done with anyone. One blistering afternoon, a sound carried on the wind that would change everything, a sound that would lead her to a terrified child, a ring of hungry predators, and a choice that would bring the thunder of war drums to her very doorstep. This is the story of that choice. The heat of that July afternoon was a physical weight. It pressed down on the tin roof of Martha Sullivan's cabin, baked the clay earth into a cracked mosaic, and shimmered in waves above the sparse buffalo grass. For 2 years since her husband, Cormac, had been taken by a fever that moved faster than any horse, this silence had been Martha's only companion. It was a silence filled with the buzz of horseflies, the rustle of unseen things in the scrub, and the lonely whistle of the wind carving its way through the canyons of the Llano Estacado. She was mending a leather strap for the well bucket, her hands rough and calloused, working with the familiar economy of motion that solitude teaches. Her knuckles were scarred, her face tanned and lined by a sun that offered no mercy. At 43, she possessed a resilience that was less a feature of her character and more a condition of her survival. She didn't have the luxury of fragility. That's when she heard it. At first, it was just a sliver of sound, thin and sharp, almost mistaken for the cry of a hawk. But it came again, higher and more desperate. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was the sound of a child. Martha froze her needle, hovering over the leather. She scanned the horizon. Nothing but the endless undulating plains and the distant hazy shapes of the mesas. There were no other homesteads for 20 miles. The nearest settlement, the dusty collection of saloons and suppliers, called Redemption Creek, was a half-day's ride if the weather was kind. No child should be out here. No one should be out here alone. She laid the strap down her heart, beginning a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. She went inside the dim, cool cabin and took Cormac's old 1873 Winchester from its pegs on the wall. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, a cold, heavy comfort. She checked the load, an instinct as natural as breathing, and stepped back out into the blinding sun. She followed the sound, moving west toward a small, rocky arroyo about a quarter mile from her cabin. The cries grew more frantic, punctuated now by a different sound, a chorus of yips and snarls that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Coyotes. A pack of them made bold by the heat and the scent of weakness. Martha picked up her pace, her worn boots kicking up puffs of red dust. As she crested the small rise overlooking the arroyo, the scene below stopped her cold. There, huddled against a sun-bleached boulder, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. Her deerskin dress was torn and smeared with dirt, and one of her small bare feet was bleeding. Her face was a mask of pure terror tears, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. And circling her, their tongues lolling and their yellow eyes glinting with predatory hunger, were at least 6 coyotes. They were closing in, emboldened by the child's fear, their movements, a sinister tightening dance. The girl was Comanche. Martha knew it from the intricate beadwork on the hem of her dress, the way her long black hair was braided with small, colorful threads. This was not just a lost child. This was a spark from a foe that the settlers and the army were trying so desperately to extinguish. To get involved was to invite trouble of a kind she couldn't possibly handle alone. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to bolt her door, and pretend she'd heard nothing. Cormac's voice echoed in her memory, a low, cautious rumble. "Don't go looking for the world's sorrows, Martha. It'll bring 'em to you soon enough." But then the lead coyote, a big male with a ragged ear, lunged. The little girl shrieked a sound of pure final terror and squeezed her eyes shut. Something inside Martha snapped. Cormac was gone. His caution was the voice of a ghost. She was alive, and so was that a child. For now. "Get away from her! Get!" Martha screamed, her voice cracking from disuse. She raised the Winchester to her shoulder. She didn't want to fire, not unless she had to. The sound would carry for miles. Instead, she levered around into the chamber with a loud metallic clack. The sound was enough to make the coyotes pause. Their heads swiveled toward her, their ears pricked. She started down the slope, moving not with aggression, but with a large, intimidating presence, waving her free arm. "Go on now, Git." The pack was hesitant. They saw her as a bigger threat, but the promise of an easy meal was a powerful lure. The big male growled a low rumble in its chest and took a step back toward the girl. That was enough. Martha aimed not at the animal, but at the ground a few feet in front of it. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening crack that shattered the afternoon silence. Dust and gravel exploded where the bullet hit. The coyotes, their nerve broken by the blast, scattered in an instant, melting back into the landscape as if they were never there. Silence returned, thick and heavy. The only sound was the girl's ragged, hitching sobs. Martha lowered the rifle, her own breath unsteady. She walked slowly toward the child, holding her empty hands out to show she meant no harm. The girl watched her, her dark eyes wide with a fear that had now transferred from the animals to the strange white woman with the thunder stick. "It's all right," Martha said softly, her voice gentle. "They're gone now. You're safe." The girl didn't understand the words, but she must have understood the tone. She flinched as Martha knelt beside her, but didn't try to run. Martha saw the gash on her foot was deep, a nasty cut from a sharp rock caked with dirt and blood. It needed cleaning, and soon, or infection would set in. "Come on, little one," Martha murmured more to herself than to the child. "Let's get you fixed up." She reached out, slowly. The girl trembled, but allowed Martha to gently scoop her up. She was lighter than a sack of flour, a fragile bundle of bones and fear. As Martha carried her back toward the cabin, the little girl buried her face in Martha's shoulder and began to cry again. But this time the sobs were not of terror, but of utter exhaustion. Martha glanced back at the empty arroyo, then scanned the vast, silent horizon. She had just saved a life. But as the door of her cabin clicked shut behind them, a cold dread settled in her stomach. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she hadn't ended the danger. She had only invited a new, far more unpredictable kind to her home. She had picked up the world's sorrows, and now she would have to see where they led. Inside the cabin, the oppressive heat gave way to a shadowed stillness. Martha laid the child gently on her own cot, the girl's small form barely making an impression on the corn husk mattress. She was asleep before her head hit the pillow, a deep trauma-induced slumber. For a moment, Martha just watched her. The fine, delicate features, the smudge of tears on her cheek, the gentle rise and fall of her chest. She looked so much younger than the fierce terror in her eyes had suggested. A fierce protective instinct, one Martha hadn't felt in years, surged through her. She was a mother without a child, a wife without a husband. This small, breathing person in her cabin was a painful reminder of everything she had lost and a terrifying responsibility she had just claimed. She worked quietly, efficiently. She heated water on the cast-iron stove, her movements practiced and sure. She tore a strip from one of her few clean linen cloths to make a bandage. With a soft rag and a basin of warm, soapy water, she began to clean the wound on the girl's foot. The child stirred and whimpered in her sleep, but didn't wake as Martha carefully washed away the dirt and applied a generous smear of pine sap salve, a remedy her own mother had taught her. As she worked, she noticed more details. A small leather pouch was tied to the girl's waist, containing a smooth, polished river stone and a single, brilliant blue feather. On her wrist was a simple bracelet of woven sinew. These were a child's treasures. Her parents would be looking for her. They would be frantic. And when Comanche warriors were frantic, they were dangerous. She gave the girl the nickname Little Sparrow in her mind. It fit the delicate, frightened creature who had landed on her doorstep. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, a knot of anxiety tightened in Martha's gut. Staying here was a risk. The Comanche would follow their daughter's trail, and it would lead directly here. They wouldn't stop to ask questions. They would see a white homesteader with their missing child and assume the worst. The stories from other settlers were grim tales of swift, brutal retribution for perceived wrongs. She had one other option, as dangerous as it was: Redemption Creek. The town had a sheriff, a man named Brody. He was a hard man, but generally fair. Maybe he could help. Maybe the U.S. Army outpost at Fort Griffin could be contacted. Surely they had procedures for this. It was a long shot. More likely the townsfolk would see the girl as a threat, a savage, and demand she be cast out. But it was better than waiting here for a war party to descend. The decision made, she moved quickly. She couldn't take her wagon. It was too slow. She would have to ride Cormac's old gelding, Dusty. He was steady and reliable. She wrote a quick note on a scrap of paper, "Gone to town, back by morning," and pinned it to her cabin door, a futile gesture of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. She gently woke Little Sparrow. The girl's eyes flew open wide with renewed panic. "Shh. It's all right, Martha," soothed using her calmest voice. She pointed to the girl's bandaged foot, then to herself, then made a rocking motion with her arms like holding a baby. She pointed out the door toward the horse. The girl seemed to understand bits and pieces, her fear giving way to a weary confusion. Getting her onto the horse was a challenge, but Martha managed seating the child in front of her, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, despite the heat. With the Winchester secured in its saddle scabbard and a small canteen of water, she urged Dusty into a steady trot, heading east. The 2-hour ride to Redemption Creek was a torment of second-guessing. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing rider. Every distant rock formation looked like a warrior on horseback. Little Sparrow was silent the whole way, her small body tense against Martha's, her eyes scanning the landscape with a knowledge far beyond her years. She was looking for her people, too. Redemption Creek was less a town and more an argument with the wilderness. It consisted of a single, dusty main street, flanked by a dozen wooden buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, 2 saloons whose piano music was already starting to jangle in the late afternoon air, and the sheriff's office which doubled as a jail. As Martha rode in, heads turned. Conversations stopped. The sight of a lone woman was common enough, but the sight of her with a Comanche child held tight in her arms was an event. Faces peered from windows and doorways, their expressions ranging from simple curiosity to open hostility. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store. Mrs. Gable, a notorious town gossip, stopped her work and stared, her mouth a thin, disapproving line. Martha ignored them all, dismounting in front of the sheriff's office. She helped little Sparrow down the child, clinging to her leg, half hiding behind her skirt. Sheriff Isaac Brody was sitting behind his desk, a hulking figure whose gut strained the buttons of his vest. He had a tired, drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much trouble to be surprised by anything. He looked up as Martha entered, his gaze immediately falling on the child. He sighed a long, weary sound and leaned back in his chair. "Martha," he said, his voice a low gravel, "don't tell me you kicked over a hornet's nest. Tell me that ain't what you did." "Her name is—" "I don't know her name." Martha began, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I found her in the arroyo west of my place. A pack of coyotes had her cornered. She was alone and hurt." Brody ran a hand over his bald head. "Alone? You say, Martha, there's a whole Quahadi war band scouring the territory between here and the Red River, led by a chief they call Kono. Word from the scouts is his daughter went missing from their hunting camp 2 days ago during a flash flood. They think she was either washed away or taken." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "They ain't gonna believe the coyote story. They're gonna find her trail leading to your cabin, and they're gonna see you took her. That's kidnapping in their book. And their book is written in blood. What am I supposed to do, Isaac?" Martha pleaded. "Leave her for the coyotes. I'm bringing her to you. You're the law." "The law." Brody gave a short, bitter laugh. "I've got 3 deputies to cover 500 square miles of pure hell. I'm the law when a cowboy gets too drunk and shoots up the saloon. I'm not the law when it comes to the Comanche. That's army business, and Fort Griffin is 100 miles and a week of paperwork away. By then your cabin will be a pile of smoking ash." His words hung in the air, cold and sharp. "So you won't help?" Martha asked, her voice quiet. "I'm helping you right now by giving you the best advice you're gonna get," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Take the girl. Ride west back the way you came. Leave her somewhere safe, somewhere her people can find her. Leave her belongings with her. Then you ride back to your cabin, and you pray they find her before they find you. Leave her alone in the dark." The idea was monstrous. "She's got a better chance of surviving a night on the prairie than you do of surviving a visit from Kono Brody," said flatly. "You made a choice when you picked her up, Martha. Now you got to make another one. You can't save the world." Martha looked down at little Sparrow, who was watching the exchange with wide, intelligent eyes. The child had no idea her fate was being debated by these 2 adults, but she clutched Martha's skirt tighter. In that small gesture, Martha's decision was solidified. She had made a promise to that child, unspoken, but binding the moment she fired that rifle. She couldn't break it. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I won't abandon her." Sheriff Brody stared at her for a long moment. A flicker of something, was it? Respect or pity in his tired eyes. He shook his head slowly. You always were as stubborn as your husband. God help you, Martha, because I surely can't. Without another word, Martha turned and led the child back outside. The setting sun was now painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air was cooling, but a different kind of chill was settling over Martha. The stares of the townsfolk felt heavier now, laced with a new knowledge of the danger she was in. They weren't just curious. They were watching a woman walk toward her own funeral. She mounted Dusty settled little Sparrow in front of her and kicked the horse into a trot, heading back the way she came. She was riding away from the only sliver of civilization back toward the isolated cabin, back toward the trouble she had been warned was coming. The lights of Redemption Creek faded behind her, and she was swallowed by the immense, darkening plains. The world was shrinking, and soon it would be no bigger than the four walls of her cabin. The ride back was a journey into a different world. The familiar landscape of her homestead was now alien and menacing under the pale light of a rising crescent moon. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe, taking on the form of a crouching man. The wind, which had been a constant, monotonous companion, now seemed to whisper warnings she couldn't quite decipher. Little Sparrow was awake, but eerily still. She wasn't looking at the path ahead, but was scanning the dark horizon from side to side, her head moving in small, sharp jerks. She was listening, searching, for what Martha could only guess. A landmark, a signal, her people. When the faint, solitary light of her cabin's window appeared in the distance, Martha felt a pang of relief so sharp it was almost painful. It was a beacon in the vast darkness. But as they drew closer, the feeling evaporated, replaced by a primal sense of wrongness. The silence around the cabin was too deep. The insects were quiet. The night birds were not singing. It was the heavy, listening silence of a place under observation. She dismounted cautiously, keeping Dusty between her and the open plains. She unholstered her Colt revolver, the weight of it a small reassurance in her palm, and helped little Sparrow to the ground. Holding the girl's hand, she moved quickly to the door, unlocked it, and pushed them both inside, bolting it securely behind them. The cabin was exactly as she'd left it. The fire in the stove was down to glowing embers. The single lantern cast a warm, steady glow over the small room. It was an island of peace in a sea of dread. Martha took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe Brody was just a cynic, and her fear was getting the better of her. She gave little Sparrow a drink of water and a piece of hardtack, which the girl nibbled on hesitantly. Martha moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. She saw nothing but the moonlit plains, vast and empty. She stayed there for a long time, watching, waiting. The silence stretched, and then it came. Thump. It was so faint she thought she'd imagined it, a trick of the wind or the beating of her own heart. Thump, thump, thump. There it was again. Deeper this time. Resonant. It was the sound of a hand drum, beaten slowly, deliberately. It came from the south. Another drum answered from the west. Thump, thump, thump. Then another from the north, and another from the east. Soon the sounds began to merge to find a rhythm. It was a slow, inexorable heartbeat that grew not just in volume, but in presence. It wasn't just a sound she was hearing. It was a sound she was feeling. It vibrated through the wooden floorboards of the cabin, through the soles of her boots, up into her very bones. The drums were all around her, a tightening circle of sound that was methodically strangling the silence of the night. Little Sparrow heard it too. The girl froze, the hardtack falling from her fingers. She stood bolt upright in the center of the room, her head cocked, her eyes wide. But the terror that Martha expected to see was not there. In its place was something else, recognition. The drumming grew more complex. The slow, single beats were joined by faster, more intricate rhythms, weaving in and out of each other. It was a language of its own, a conversation she could not understand, but whose meaning was terrifyingly clear. We are here. We know you are here. We have you surrounded. Martha extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into near total darkness, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the window cracks and the dying orange glow from the stove's grate. She pulled Little Sparrow down to the floor with her, her arm protectively around the child's shoulders. "It's okay," she whispered, her own voice trembling. "Stay down." The girl didn't seem to hear her. Her attention was fixed on the sound. Her lips parted, and she let out a small, quiet cry, a single word that cut through the rhythmic thunder. 8. It was a Comanche word. Martha didn't know the language, but the meaning was universal, as old as humanity itself. Father. The word confirmed everything. This wasn't some random band. This was Kono's war party. The girl's father was out there in the darkness, and he had come for his daughter. Martha crept back to the window and risked another look. In the pale moonlight, she could see them now, not clearly, but as fleeting silhouettes. A figure on horseback atop the small ridge to the west. Another moving through the scrub brush to the south. They were shadows, patient and deadly, materializing out of the night. They made no move to attack. They didn't need to. The drums were their weapon. It was psychological warfare, designed to fray the nerves, to inspire terror, to break the will of whoever was trapped inside. And it was working. Every creak of the cabin walls, every gust of wind made her jump. The drumming was relentless, a monstrous pulse that seemed to count down the final moments of her life. She was trapped, a lone woman, a small child, and a single-shot rifle against a Comanche war party whose patience was born of absolute confidence. She looked at Little Sparrow huddled on the floor. The girl was no longer crying. She was listening intently, her face a mixture of fear for the woman who had saved her, and a deep instinctual longing for the father who was now besieging them. Martha felt a profound and terrible irony. She had saved this child from the laws of nature, the coyotes, only to be condemned by the laws of men. She had acted out of the purest instinct a person could have, and for that, the world outside her door was now promising her a violent death. The drums beat on a steady rhythmic promise of the dawn and the reckoning it would bring. The night bled away with agonizing slowness, each minute measured by the unceasing heartbeat of the drums. Martha sat with her back against the cabin wall, the Winchester laid across her lap. She didn't sleep. She listened. Little Sparrow had eventually curled up on a rag rug by the cold stove and fallen into a fitful sleep, her small face etched with a tension that shouldn't belong to a child. As the first hint of grey began to soften the eastern sky, the drumming changed. The complex rhythms ceased, replaced once more by a single, slow, deliberate beat. It was a summons. Martha rose on stiff limbs, her body aching from the long, fearful vigil. She moved to the window and peered out. In the growing light, she could see them clearly now. There were at least 15 warriors, some on horseback, some on foot, forming a loose, impenetrable circle around her property. They were lean, powerful men, their faces painted for war. their expressions grim and unreadable. They held bows, lances, matantools, and a few had rifles of their own. One rider detached himself from the group and trotted his pinto pony forward until he was about 50 yards from the cabin door. He was a man of commanding presence, broad-shouldered and powerfully built. His face, etched with lines of grief and fury, was framed by 2 long braids decorated with eagle feathers. A magnificent cougar hide quiver was slung across his back. Even from this distance, Martha could feel the intensity of his gaze. This had to be the leader. This had to be Kono. He raised a hand, palm open a sign to parley. But it was not a request. It was a command. Martha's mind raced. What could she possibly do? A shootout was suicide. But surrendering the girl felt like a betrayal. She had to try to make him understand. Taking a deep breath, she unbolted the heavy door and opened it just a crack, keeping the bulk of the wood between her and the warriors outside. The cool morning air felt electric with tension. Kono's voice boomed across the clearing, speaking in the Comanche tongue. It was a torrent of harsh, guttural sounds, but his tone was unmistakable. It was a demand. He pointed from his own chest to the cabin, then made a gesture as if gathering something to himself. "You have something of mine. Give it to me." Martha swallowed hard. "I don't understand you," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. She held up her empty hands, stepping out from behind the door, just enough to be seen. "The girl. I found her coyotes, I saved her." She pointed west toward the arroyo and made snarling motions with her hands, mimicking the predators. One of the younger warriors shouted something and angrily raised his rifle, but Kono silenced him with a sharp gesture. The chief's eyes narrowed, studying Martha. There was no flicker of understanding, only cold, hard suspicion. To him, her story was likely a convenient lie. He saw a white woman, a settler on land his people considered their own, who had somehow taken his child. His grief and rage left no room for any other interpretation. He spoke again, slower this time, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He pointed at the sun, then drew a line across the sky to its zenith. He was giving her a deadline. Noon. Just then, Little Sparrow, awakened by the voices, appeared at the open door behind Martha. Her eyes lit up, and she cried out again. Kono's stoic expression finally broke. A wave of raw emotion, relief, pain, love washed over his face. He spurred his horse forward a few steps, his hand outstretched toward his daughter. "Aita." He called, his voice thick with feeling. So that was her name, Aita. The standoff was now at its most volatile point. The father could see his child alive and well. The warriors grew more agitated, seeing their chief's daughter held within a settler's cabin. Martha knew she was out of time and options. She had to give Aita back. But before she could move, a new sound intruded, the sharp crack of a rifle fired from a long distance. It was not a Comanche rifle. The sound was different, heavier. The bullet didn't hit the cabin or any of the warriors. It kicked up a puff of dust in the dirt, halfway between Kono and Martha, a deliberate, provocative shot. Instantly, the tense standoff shattered into chaos. The Comanche warriors dove for cover, their years of battle instinct taking over. Kono wheeled his horse around, shouting orders. His attention ripped away from the cabin and towards the source of the shot, a rocky outcrop to the northwest. Martha ducked back inside, pulling a terrified Aita with her. Who was shooting the army? Other settlers. A second shot rang out, and this time a Comanche warrior cried out and fell from his horse, clutching his leg. A third shot followed, then a fourth. This wasn't a warning. This was an ambush. And then she saw them. A group of riders, maybe 10 in all, emerged from behind the rocks, firing as they came. They were white men, but they were not soldiers. They were rough, bearded men, in dusty, mismatched clothing, their faces hardened by cruelty, not duty. They looked like vultures descending on a kill. Leading them was a man on a big black stallion, a gaunt figure with a long, grey-streaked beard and cold, dead eyes. He wore a patched-up Confederate cavalry coat and wielded a massive Sharps rifle. Martha had heard stories in Redemption Creek about a man like that. A man who led a band of scalp hunters and outlaws who preyed on settlers and natives alike, profiting from the chaos on the frontier. They called him Silas Kane. Some called him the Vulture. Kane and his men weren't there to save her. They weren't there for justice. They saw a Comanche war party distracted and exposed, and they saw an opportunity for bounty and plunder. They were firing indiscriminately at any Comanche they could see. The Comanche, caught completely off guard, were in disarray. They had come prepared for a confrontation at a cabin, not a full-blown firefight from a hidden enemy. Another warrior went down, shot from his horse. Through the window, Martha saw Kono desperately trying to rally his men, urging them to fight back. But they were pinned down. One of Kane's men took aim at Kono, who was momentarily exposed as he helped a wounded brave. In that split second, Martha faced a terrible choice. She could stay hidden, let the two groups destroy each other, and hope whoever was left standing would spare her. It was the safe choice. The logical choice. But then she saw the look on Aita's face. The girl was pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with terror, watching her father about to be shot down. Martha's choice was no longer logical. It was human. These men, Kane's men, were the true monsters. They were the source of the chaos, the indiscriminate evil that Sheriff Brody had warned her about. Kono was a father trying to get his daughter back. With a surge of adrenaline, Martha grabbed her Winchester, rested the barrel on the edge of the window frame, and took aim. She wasn't aiming for Kane's man. She was aiming for his horse. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The horse screamed and collapsed, throwing its rider to the ground. The shot that had been meant for Kono went wide, burying itself in the dirt. The world outside fell silent for a stunned heartbeat. Kane's men, the Comanche. Everyone looked toward the cabin, toward the puff of smoke from the window. Kono, momentarily safe, stared at the cabin, his expression one of utter disbelief. The white woman, his enemy, had just saved his life. The entire dynamic of the battle of the day had just been irrevocably twisted. The real enemy was not in the cabin. The enemy was the one with the Sharps rifle, laughing from his saddle as he reloaded. Silas Kane's laughter was a harsh, grating sound that cut through the sudden silence. "Well, looky here, boys," he bellowed, his voice carrying easily in the morning air. "The little prairie hen has her claws. Seems she's taken a liking to her redskin suitors. Makes no difference. We get paid for their scalps all the same. And the government pays a bounty for a renegade's brat, too." His words, dripping with venom and greed, erased any lingering doubt. He wasn't just an outlaw. He was a symptom of the festering hatred that plagued the frontier, a man who profited from turning people against each other. Kono's head snapped from the cabin back toward Kane. His eyes, which had been filled with suspicion for Martha, now burned with a pure, focused hatred for the man on the black horse. He shouted a string of commands to his warriors. They understood instantly. The woman in the cabin was no longer the primary threat. The firefight erupted again. But this time, it was different. It was no longer a one-sided ambush. The Comanche masters of prairie warfare used the terrain to their advantage. They melted behind rocks and into gullies, presenting fleeting targets. Arrows began to fly, silent and deadly, thudding into the ground near Kane's men, or in one case finding a home in the shoulder of a raider who had been too slow to find cover. Martha was now an active participant in a battle she never wanted. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. Cormac had taught her to shoot not for sport, but for survival. "Aim slow, shoot fast," he used to say. "Don't think about the man, just think about the target." She saw one of Kane's men setting up behind a dead cottonwood tree, taking careful aim at a young Comanche brave who was trying to drag a wounded companion to safety. Martha didn't hesitate. She lined up her sights, exhaled slowly, and fired. The raider cried out and clutched his arm, his rifle falling to the ground. He scrambled away out of the fight. From his position behind a cluster of boulders, Kono saw it happen. He glanced toward the cabin, a quick, sharp look of acknowledgement. An unspoken message passed between the besieged homesteader and the Comanche chief. "We are in this together." An unlikely, desperate alliance was born in the chaos of gun smoke and battle cries. Martha's cabin, once the focal point of the siege, was now a fortified position, a small bastion providing critical covering fire. Her single rifle was a force multiplier. Because she was elevated and protected, she could see the field in a way the Comanche pinned to the ground could not. She called out warnings when she could. "Rider on the left flank. Behind the rocks." They couldn't understand her words, but they understood her intent. They followed the direction of her rifle barrel, the sharp crack of her Winchester a signal of where the next threat lay. Aita, who had been cowering by the stove, seemed to draw strength from Martha's resolve. The child crept to the window, staying low, and began to act as a spotter for Martha. Her young eyes were sharp. She would point a small, trembling finger. "Sik amakai," she'd whisper, pointing at a raider moving through the brush. Martha would shift her aim, trusting the girl's instincts. They were a team, the white woman who couldn't speak Comanche, and the Comanche girl who couldn't speak English, united in the defense of the girl's father. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. One of Kane's men managed to get close to the cabin, thinking it an easy target. He burst from the cover of the well, a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of crazed determination. Martha didn't have time to aim the rifle. She dropped it and drew her Colt revolver from her belt, firing 2 quick shots through the open doorway. The man staggered back, surprise on his face, before collapsing into the dust. Martha felt a wave of nausea, but she shoved it down. There was no time for sickness or remorse. Kane was furious. His easy raid had turned into a bloody, protracted fight. He had lost 3 men with more wounded. He roared in frustration, firing his powerful Sharps rifle at the cabin. The heavy slug tore through the wooden wall just inches from Martha's head, showering her and Aita with splinters. The cabin offered cover, but it wouldn't stand up to that kind of firepower for long. Kono and his warriors pressed their advantage. Seeing Kane's attention fixed on the cabin, 2 braves executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, crawling through the tall grass like snakes. They rose up on the edge of Kane's position, letting fly a volley of arrows before disappearing back into the terrain. The tide was turning. Kane's men, who fought for money, not for a cause, began to lose their nerve. Their fire became sporadic, less accurate. They were looking for a way out. Cain knew it too. But he was not a man who accepted defeat. His cold eyes scanned the battlefield, looking for one last desperate gambit to turn this disaster into a victory. His gaze fell upon Kono, who was momentarily isolated as he reloaded his own rifle. The vulture saw his chance. Kicking his stallion into a gallop, he charged directly at the Comanche chief, his long-bladed skinning knife flashing in the morning sun. Silas Cain's charge was the desperate act of a cornered predator. He thundered across the open ground, his face contorted in a mask of fury, the huge black stallion eating up the distance to Kono. The Comanche chief, caught with an empty rifle, had only seconds to react. He dropped the useless firearm and drew his own knife, bracing for the impact. The remaining raiders and warriors paused the firefight momentarily, forgotten all eyes fixed on the two leaders. Martha saw it all unfolding from the window. Cain had the advantage of height speed and momentum. He would be on Kono before the chief could properly defend himself. She tried to bring her Winchester to bear, but the black horse was moving too fast, too erratically. A shot risked hitting Kono himself. Panic gave way to a flash of desperate inspiration. On the small table next to her was the lantern she had extinguished earlier. It was still half full of kerosene. Without a second thought, she grabbed it, fumbled with a match from the box on the mantelpiece, and lit the wick. As Cain closed in on Kono, leaning low from his saddle for the killing strike, Martha swung the lantern in a wide arc and hurled it out of the window. It sailed through the air, a small fiery comet, and shattered on the ground right in the path of Cain's charging horse. Kerosene splashed across a patch of dry grass and scrub brush, which instantly erupted into a wall of bright, hungry flames. The stallion, terrified by the sudden roar of fire, reared violently, screaming in panic. Cain, caught completely by surprise, was thrown from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him, his knife flying from his grasp. The diversion was all Kono needed. He lunged forward, not at Cain, but at the outlaw's fallen knife, scooping it up. The battle was now on, even terms, two men on their feet, armed with blades, circled by a ring of fire. What followed was not a duel. It was a savage, brutal brawl. Cain, fueled by rage, fought like a wild animal. Kono, driven by the need to protect his child and his people, moved with the deadly grace of a seasoned warrior. They crashed together, knives flashing. The fight was short, ugly, and decisive. In a final, desperate move, Cain lunged. Kono sidestepped, twisted, and drove the blade home. Silas Cain sank to his knees, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. He stared down at the knife buried in his chest, then looked up at Kono. He opened his mouth, but only a gurgle of blood emerged. He fell forward into the dust and was still. The death of their leader broke the raiders' morale completely. The remaining few scrambled for their horses and fled, vanishing back into the plains as quickly as they had appeared, leaving their dead and wounded behind. Silence, profound and absolute, descended upon the battlefield. The only sounds were the crackle of the burning grass, the mournful cry of a wounded man, and the heaving breaths of the survivors. The battle was over. The Comanche warriors slowly emerged from their cover, their faces a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and victory. They gathered around their chief, who stood breathing heavily over the body of Silas Cain. Then Kono turned his gaze to the cabin. This was the moment. The alliance born of necessity was over. The common enemy was defeated. Now only the original conflict remained: the white woman and the Comanche child. Martha's heart, which had been pounding with the thrill of battle, now seemed to stop altogether. She watched as Kono, his face unreadable, began to walk slowly toward her cabin. His warriors followed at a distance, their expressions guarded, uncertain. She stood in the doorway, her empty rifle hanging limply at her side. She was spent emotionally and physically. There was no fight left in her. She had done all she could. Kono stopped 10 feet from her door. He was covered in dust and blood, some of it his own, some of it Kane's. He looked from Martha to the small face peeking out from behind her skirts. Slowly, deliberately, Martha stepped aside, leaving the doorway clear. Aita hesitated for only a second. Then she ran. She flew across the dusty ground and threw herself into her father's arms. Kono dropped to one knee and enveloped her in a hug, burying his face in her hair. His broad shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs of a father who had feared the worst and been granted a miracle. The fierce war chief was gone, and in his place was only a man holding his world in his arms. After a long moment he stood still, holding his daughter's hand. He looked at Martha. The suspicion was gone. The anger was gone. In their place was something she had never expected to see in the eyes of a Comanche warrior, a deep, profound, and undeniable respect. He spoke not in his own tongue, but in the few halting English words he knew, words learned from traders or treaties saved for moments of great importance. "You fight good," he said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to the fallen raiders, then to his own chest. "You save my people." He looked at Aita. "You save my daughter." He reached to his own braided hair and untied one of the eagle feathers, a sacred symbol of honor, courage, and great deeds. He stepped forward and held it out to her. Martha looked at the feather, then back at his face. This was more than a thank you. It was a gift of immense significance, a recognition of her as a warrior, as an equal. It was a debt being paid. She reached out with a trembling hand and took it. Her fingers brushed his, a brief contact between two worlds that had for one violent morning become one. "Thank you," she whispered. Kono gave a single solemn nod. He turned, and with Aita's hand held tightly in his, he walked back to his warriors. They tended to their wounded, gathered their dead, and without a single backward glance mounted their horses. Within minutes they were gone, melting back into the vast plains from which they had come. Martha was left alone in the sudden jarring silence, standing in the doorway of her bullet-scarred cabin. The sun was climbing higher in the sky. The smell of gun smoke still hung in the air. In her hand, she held a single eagle feather. She was alone again. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the echoes of drums, the crack of rifles, and the memory of a choice that had brought war, and unexpectedly, a profound and unbreakable peace to her doorstep. The world had brought its sorrows to her, just as Cormac had predicted. But it had brought her something else, too. The knowledge that even on the loneliest edge of the frontier, a single act of courage could build a bridge across any divide. Martha Sullivan never saw Kono or Aita again, but for the rest of her days on that harsh and beautiful land, no harm ever came to her homestead. Travelers would sometimes speak of a lone cabin that the Comanche seemed to protect, a place they would pass with a nod of respect. Martha lived out her years, a quiet legend on the plains, forever changed by the desperate cry she chose not to ignore. Her story is a stark reminder that history isn't just made by armies and generals, but in the heart of a single person facing an impossible choice. It's about the courage to see humanity in the face of an enemy, and the unexpected alliances that can be forged in the fires of conflict. It teaches us that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most profound connections. If this story from the forgotten corners of the Wild West moved you, please consider giving this video a like and sharing it with someone who appreciates tales of courage and resilience. And for more true stories and lost legends from history, make sure you subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. Thank you for listening.